Tonight, we begin a slow and careful journey into the final years of one of England's most remarkable monarchs, Queen Elizabeth I. This is not a story of sudden tragedy or dramatic collapse, but a quiet historical investigation into decline, uncertainty, and the limits of medicine in the early modern world. As the pace slows, allow the noise of the present to fade, and let us step gently into the closing chapter of Elizabeth's long life. Elizabeth I ruled England for more than 40 years, a period now known as the Elizabethan Age. By the time she reached old age, she had survived political threats, religious conflict, war, and personal loss. Yet, like all humans, she could not escape the slow changes of the body. When Elizabeth died in March 1603, no clear medical diagnosis was recorded. Doctors of the time lacked modern understanding of disease, and court etiquette often limited honest reporting. As a result, historians must rely on letters, eyewitness accounts, ambassador reports, and later analysis to understand what may have caused her death. By the late 1590s, Elizabeth was already showing signs of physical decline. Contemporary sources describe her as increasingly thin, tired, and withdrawn. She suffered from bouts of melancholy and long periods of silence. Once known for energy and sharp wit, she began avoiding public appearances. This withdrawal was not sudden. It unfolded slowly over several years, suggesting chronic illness rather than a single fatal event. In her final months, Elizabeth reportedly stopped eating properly. Court observers noted that she stood for hours without moving, then collapsed into exhaustion. She slept little and refused medical help. This refusal is historically significant. Elizabeth distrusted physicians and was deeply concerned with control and dignity. She preferred to endure quietly rather than submit to treatments she believed might weaken her authority or appearance. This decision may have worsened whatever illness she was already facing. One widely discussed possibility is blood poisoning or infection. Elizabeth had a history of poor dental health, and tooth infections were extremely dangerous in the 16th century. Without antibiotics, even a small infection could spread through the bloodstream. Some historians suggest that an untreated dental abscess may have led to septic complications. This theory fits the slow decline, loss of appetite, weakness, and eventual death. Another possibility is pneumonia or respiratory illness. England's winters were cold and damp, and Elizabeth was elderly by the standards of her time. Respiratory infections were common and often fatal. Reports of weakness, fatigue, and withdrawal could align with such an illness, especially if compounded by malnutrition and exhaustion. There is also discussion of depression contributing to her death. In the final years of her life, Elizabeth experienced significant emotional loss. Many trusted advisors and close companions had died. The death of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, whom she had reluctantly ordered executed, weighed heavily on her. Modern historians note that severe depression can weaken the immune system, reduce appetite, and hasten physical decline. While depression alone would not be listed as a cause of death in that era, it may have played a significant role. Importantly, there is no credible historical evidence that Elizabeth was poisoned. Although rumors circulated, as they often did around powerful figures, no contemporary account supports deliberate poisoning. The orderly transition of power to James VI of Scotland also makes conspiracy unlikely. Elizabeth's death appears to have been anticipated, not sudden. From a historical perspective, Elizabeth's death reflects the limits of early modern medicine. Physicians relied on humoral theory, bloodletting, and herbal remedies. These treatments often did more harm than good. Elizabeth's refusal of treatment may have spared her suffering, but it also removed any chance of intervention that might have extended her life. As this first part comes to rest, imagine the Queen in her final winter. The court is quiet. Tapestries hang heavy in cold rooms. Candles burn low. A long reign draws toward its natural end, shaped not by violence but by age, illness, and the slow fading of strength. Historical accounts of Elizabeth I's final days come primarily from courtiers, ambassadors, and later chroniclers, who observed the quiet transformation of the royal court in early 1603. By this time, Elizabeth was nearly 70 years old, an advanced age for the period. The atmosphere around her was one of restraint and uncertainty. No official announcements were made about her health, yet many at court understood that the long reign was approaching its end. Silence, rather than alarm, defined these weeks. Elizabeth spent much of her final winter at Richmond Palace. Contemporary reports describe her withdrawing almost completely from public life. She refused to lie down, choosing instead to stand or sit upright for long hours, even through the night. Courtiers noted that she slept very little. This behavior puzzled observers at the time and continues to interest historians. Some interpret it as a sign of physical discomfort, others as a psychological response to loss of control. In early modern belief, lying down was sometimes associated with surrender or death. Elizabeth may have resisted rest as a symbolic act, clinging to authority through posture alone. Food refusal became more pronounced during this period. Letters from court mention that she ate very little and often pushed meals away untouched. Loss of appetite is a common symptom in many illnesses, but it can also reflect depression or exhaustion. Elizabeth had long associated eating and appearance with strength and dignity. As her body weakened, she may have chosen restraint over vulnerability. This refusal likely accelerated physical decline, leaving her increasingly frail. Medical attention was offered but largely rejected. Elizabeth had a complicated relationship with physicians. She was aware that common treatments involved bleeding, purging, or strong compounds, which could leave patients visibly weaker. For a monarch who had built her authority on image and composure, such outcomes were unacceptable. Doctors were therefore limited in what they could do, and their observations were cautious, filtered through respect and fear of overstepping boundaries. Eyewitness descriptions from the final days emphasize stillness. Elizabeth spoke little. She sat motionless for extended periods, eyes open but distant. Some accounts describe her holding a finger to her lips, signaling silence. This behavior has been interpreted in many ways. It may reflect pain, fatigue, or deep introspection. It may also reflect the ceremonial gravity of a monarch preparing for death without words. In Tudor culture, silence carried meaning, especially for someone whose words had shaped policy for decades. Despite her decline, there is no record of sudden collapse. Elizabeth's death appears to have been gradual and expected by those closest to her. On the night of 23 March 1603, she became weaker and eventually lost consciousness. She died peacefully in the early hours of the morning. The absence of dramatic symptoms such as convulsions or fever suggests a chronic condition rather than acute poisoning or injury. Immediately after her death, the court moved swiftly to secure succession. This calm transition is historically important. It suggests that Elizabeth's illness had been anticipated and quietly accepted. Preparations had likely been made in advance, further supporting the idea of a slow, observable decline rather than a sudden fatal event. From a historical perspective, these final days reveal much about Elizabeth's character. She maintained control through silence, posture, and refusal, rather than command. Her death was not marked by medical drama, but by withdrawal. This pattern aligns with many elderly deaths in the early modern period, especially among those who resisted intervention. As this part settles into quiet, imagine the court of Richmond Palace at night. The corridors are still, candles flicker softly, servants move without sound. A long reign nears its end, not with spectacle, but with restraint and dignity. To understand what may have caused the death of Elizabeth I, it is necessary to step gently into the medical world of late Tudor England. This was a time before modern diagnosis, before germ theory, and before effective treatment for infection. Illness was understood through balance rather than biology. Doctors believed that health depended on the harmony of bodily fluids, known as humors, and when this balance failed, the body slowly weakened. In such a world, death often arrived quietly without a clear name. One of the most widely discussed medical possibilities is infection, particularly blood infection caused by dental disease. Elizabeth was known to have severe problems with her teeth later in life. Contemporary accounts describe toothaches, missing teeth, and chronic pain. In the 16th century, dental care was extremely limited. Tooth infections were common and dangerous. Without antibiotics, bacteria could spread from the mouth into the bloodstream, leading to what modern medicine would call sepsis. Symptoms often included weakness, loss of appetite, confusion, and gradual organ failure. These signs closely matched the descriptions of Elizabeth's final decline. Another possible cause is respiratory illness. England's climate was cold and damp, and respiratory infections were among the most common causes of death for the elderly. Pneumonia, bronchitis, or other lung infections often developed slowly, especially in weakened bodies. Symptoms might include fatigue, breathlessness, poor sleep, and withdrawal rather than dramatic coughing or fever. In an aging queen who ate little and slept poorly, such an illness could easily become fatal without clear outward signs. Malnutrition also deserves careful consideration. In her final months, Elizabeth reportedly refused food for extended periods. Even short-term starvation can weaken the immune system, reduce muscle strength, and worsen existing illness. For an elderly person, this effect is magnified. Loss of appetite may have been both a symptom and a cause of decline, creating a slow downward cycle that doctors of the time could not reverse. There is also the question of stroke or heart failure. Sudden death from stroke was known in Tudor England, though not understood medically. However, Elizabeth's death does not appear to have been sudden. There are no reports of paralysis, sudden collapse, or loss of speech before her final hours. This makes stroke less likely as a primary cause, though underlying cardiovascular weakness cannot be ruled out entirely. Some historians have suggested cancer, particularly stomach or abdominal cancer, due to weight loss and refusal to eat. However, cancer was rarely recognized as a distinct disease at the time, and there is no direct evidence to support this theory. Without physical examination records or post-mortem practices, such conclusions remain speculative. What is most striking is how limited Tudor medicine was in responding to any of these conditions. Doctors relied on bloodletting, purging, enemas, and herbal mixtures. These treatments often weakened patients further. Elizabeth's resistance to medical intervention may have spared her discomfort, but it also meant that even basic care was absent. In effect, she allowed nature to take its course. From a historical perspective, Elizabeth's death fits a common pattern of early modern decline. Many elderly individuals faded slowly, marked by silence, stillness, and withdrawal rather than pain or crisis. Death was often seen as a natural closing rather than a medical event. Elizabeth's passing reflects this understanding. As this part grows quiet, imagine the Queen surrounded by heavy tapestries and winter air. Her body grows weaker, not through violence, but through time. Illness moves slowly, unnamed and unseen, until it no longer needs a name. Beyond physical illness, many historians believe that Elizabeth I's death cannot be fully understood without considering her psychological and emotional state during her final years. By the end of the 16th century, Elizabeth had outlived almost everyone she trusted. Long reigns often end in loneliness, and Elizabeth's was no exception. The court that once surrounded her with familiar voices had gradually emptied. Advisors, friends, and companions died one by one, leaving her increasingly isolated at the very moment when age made her most vulnerable. One of the most significant emotional blows was the loss of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. Once her favorite, Essex had been impulsive, ambitious, and ultimately disloyal. His failed rebellion in 1601 forced Elizabeth into an impossible position. As queen, she had to approve his execution. As a woman who had known him since his youth, the decision appears to have deeply affected her. Contemporary observers noted a change in her mood afterward. She became quieter, more withdrawn, and less willing to engage with those around her. The execution may have marked the moment when political authority finally overcame personal connection, leaving her emotionally exhausted. Elizabeth also faced the growing certainty of death without a direct heir. She had ruled as the Virgin Queen, carefully controlling her image and independence. But this choice carried a heavy burden at the end of her life. Questions of succession filled the court, often spoken in whispers rather than openly. This atmosphere likely increased her sense of isolation. Power was slowly shifting away from her, even before she died. For a monarch whose identity was inseparable from rule, this loss of control may have been deeply unsettling. Modern historians often suggest that Elizabeth experienced what we would now call depression. Signs include withdrawal from social contact, loss of appetite, insomnia, long periods of silence, and lack of interest in activities that once defined her. While the word depression did not exist in Tudor medicine as we understand it today, similar conditions were described as melancholy. Melancholy was believed to drain vitality and weaken the body. Even in early modern thought, it was understood that prolonged sadness could lead to physical decline. Emotional suffering can have powerful physical effects, especially in old age. Chronic grief and isolation weaken the immune system, reduce appetite, disturb sleep, and slow recovery from illness. In Elizabeth's case, emotional decline may not have been the primary cause of death, but it likely hastened the process. The mind and body were not seen as separate in Tudor belief. An imbalance in emotion was believed to create imbalance in health. Elizabeth's refusal to lie down, her resistance to food, and her silence may all reflect a psychological struggle as much as a physical one. Standing for long hours, refusing rest, and avoiding comfort can be interpreted as attempts to maintain authority and self-control in the face of decline. Rather than surrender quietly, Elizabeth may have chosen stillness and restraint as her final expression of sovereignty. From a historical perspective, this emotional decline fits the pattern of many aging rulers who lived long enough to see their power slowly diminish. Unlike sudden death in battle or illness, Elizabeth faced a prolonged ending. Her withdrawal was not weakness, but perhaps a deliberate retreat, shaped by grief, memory, and awareness of finality. As this part settles into quiet, imagine the Queen alone in a dim chamber surrounded by symbols of a lifetime of rule. The noise of politics fades, the weight of memory grows heavy, the body weakens, and the mind turns inward. In this silence, emotional wear may have gently guided the final stage of her life toward its end. Whenever a powerful monarch dies, especially one who ruled for many decades, rumors tend to follow. Elizabeth I was no exception. In the months and years after her death, whispers circulated about poison, secret plots, and hidden enemies. However, when these stories are examined carefully through historical evidence, they begin to fade into the background of fear, imagination, and political habit, rather than fact. Historians today largely agree that conspiracy theories surrounding Elizabeth's death are not supported by reliable sources. Poison was a common fear in early modern Europe. The idea of secret poisoning appeared frequently in popular imagination, literature, and political gossip. Courts were places of suspicion, and sudden deaths were often blamed on hidden enemies. Yet Elizabeth's death was not sudden. Her decline was slow, visible, and widely observed. Courtiers, ambassadors, and foreign observers all noted her weakening health over an extended period. Poison, as understood at the time, was expected to act quickly or produce dramatic symptoms. Elizabeth showed neither. There is also no record of alarm or investigation after her death. If poisoning had been suspected seriously, it would have caused immediate concern at court. Instead, the transition of power was calm and orderly. James VI of Scotland was proclaimed King of England without resistance. This smooth succession strongly suggests that Elizabeth's death was expected and accepted, not viewed as suspicious or unnatural. Some rumors pointed toward political enemies, both foreign and domestic. Elizabeth had faced threats throughout her reign, including plots supported by Spain and Catholic factions. However, by 1603, England was relatively stable. Elizabeth's enemies had little to gain from her death at that stage, as succession plans were already quietly in place. Removing her would not have caused chaos or opened new opportunities. In fact, stability benefited most parties involved. Other stories suggested that Elizabeth may have been deliberately neglected or emotionally broken by those around her. While it is true that she withdrew and resisted help, there is no evidence that her courtiers wished her harm. Many depended on a peaceful succession to protect their own positions. The atmosphere at court during her final weeks was cautious and respectful. Silence was not cruelty, but protocol. It is also important to understand how historical myths form. Elizabeth became a legendary figure even during her lifetime. After her death, writers and commentators often shaped stories to fit dramatic narratives. A slow death from age, illness, and sadness lacks excitement. Poison and intrigue feel more compelling. Over time, these imaginative stories gained attention despite lacking evidence. Modern historians rely on contemporary letters, ambassador reports, and court records. These sources consistently describe decline, weakness, withdrawal, and acceptance. None describe fear of murder or sudden illness. The absence of panic is one of the strongest arguments against conspiracy. People at the time saw what was happening. They did not see a crime. From a historical perspective, rejecting poison theories does not diminish Elizabeth's story. Instead, it humanizes it. Her death appears to have been shaped by age, emotional burden, and the limits of medicine. Like many people of her time, she died quietly, without a clear diagnosis, but with dignity and control. As this part grows quiet, imagine rumors fading as facts remain. The court continues its careful routines. Messages are sent, plans proceed. The world adjusts, not in shock, but in calm acceptance. Elizabeth's death belongs not to secret plots, but to the natural ending of a long and demanding life. After Elizabeth I died in the early hours of 24 March 1603, the English court moved into a carefully managed period of transition. Death at the center of power was never treated casually, especially when the monarch had ruled for more than 4 decades. Yet there was no sense of panic. Instead, there was order, silence, and ritual. This calm response itself offers important historical insight into how Elizabeth's death was understood at the time. News of the Queen's death was handled with great care. Official announcements were delayed until succession arrangements were secure. This was standard practice, designed to prevent unrest or uncertainty. Once confirmed, James VI of Scotland was proclaimed King James I of England. The speed and smoothness of this proclamation suggest that Elizabeth's death had been anticipated. Courtiers and officials had clearly prepared for this moment, further supporting the idea of a long, visible decline rather than sudden catastrophe. Elizabeth's body was treated with deep ceremony. She lay in state at Richmond Palace before being transported to Whitehall. Contemporary descriptions emphasized dignity and restraint. There were no public accusations, no demands for investigation, and no signs of shock. Instead, the rituals followed established royal custom. This response reflects acceptance. Those closest to the Queen appear to have seen her death as the natural conclusion of age and illness. The funeral itself took place on 28 April 1603 at Westminster Abbey. It was a grand and solemn occasion, attended by nobles, officials, and representatives of the realm. Elizabeth was buried beside her half-sister Mary the Moire, an arrangement rich with symbolic meaning. Despite their differences in religion and rule, the sisters were united in death. The ceremony focused on Elizabeth's achievements and the stability of her reign rather than the circumstances of her passing. This emphasis suggests that her death was not seen as controversial or mysterious. Public reaction, as recorded in letters and later accounts, was mixed with grief and reflection. Elizabeth had become a symbol of national identity for many English people. Her long reign had brought relative stability after years of religious conflict. While sadness was widespread, there was also relief that succession had occurred peacefully. This emotional balance reflects how her death was understood. A loss, but not a disaster. Importantly, there are no contemporary calls for inquiry into her death. In cases of suspected murder or scandal, Tudor society was not silent. Rumors would have spread quickly, especially among foreign ambassadors. Yet surviving diplomatic correspondence describes Elizabeth's decline as expected. Foreign observers noted her age, frailty, and withdrawal. None report suspicion of foul play. From a historical perspective, burial and public response offer strong evidence against dramatic explanations. Societies react loudly to unnatural deaths. They respond quietly to natural ones. Elizabeth's death was followed by ceremony, not investigation. This tells us how those who lived through it understood what had happened. As this part settles into stillness, imagine the slow procession through London streets. Bells toll softly. Crowds watch in silence. A long chapter closes, not with fear or confusion, but with acceptance. England moves forward, carrying the memory of a queen whose death came not by force but by time. When modern historians look back at the death of Elizabeth I, they do so with caution, patience, and respect for uncertainty. Unlike dramatic deaths that leave clear physical evidence, Elizabeth's passing belongs to a category that historians describe as multi-factor decline. This means that no single cause fully explains her death. Instead, it was likely the result of several conditions acting together over time, gradually weakening her body until it could no longer recover. Most scholars agree that old age itself played a central role. Elizabeth was nearly 70 years old, far beyond the average life expectancy of her era. The human body in the early 17th century faced constant stress from infection, poor medical knowledge, and harsh living conditions, even at court. Aging in such an environment often led to gradual failure rather than sudden collapse. Elizabeth's slow withdrawal, weakness, and exhaustion fit this pattern closely. Infection remains one of the strongest medical explanations supported by modern historians. Dental disease, in particular, is frequently mentioned. Tooth infections were extremely dangerous in Elizabeth's time, and there is solid evidence that she suffered from long-term dental problems. A chronic infection could have spread silently through her body, causing systemic weakness without dramatic outward symptoms. This type of illness often leads to loss of appetite, fatigue, and mental withdrawal, all of which were observed in Elizabeth's final months. Respiratory illness is also considered likely. Pneumonia and similar infections were among the most common causes of death in elderly people during this period. Such illnesses did not always produce loud coughing or visible fever, especially in weakened individuals. Instead, they often appeared as quiet exhaustion, breathlessness, poor sleep, and gradual decline. In a queen who refused rest and nourishment, recovery would have been unlikely. Historians also place significant weight on psychological decline. Modern scholarship increasingly recognizes the connection between emotional suffering and physical health. Elizabeth's final years were marked by grief, loneliness, and loss of control. Trusted advisors had died. Political power was slipping toward the future king. The execution of Essex left a deep emotional mark. Depression, even if not named as such at the time, likely weakened her body's ability to resist illness. This emotional burden may not have killed her directly, but it almost certainly hastened the process. Another important factor is Elizabeth's refusal of medical treatment. While this choice preserved her dignity, it also removed any possibility of intervention. Tudor medicine was limited and often harmful, but basic care such as rest, nourishment, and supervision might have extended her life slightly. Her resistance reflects a conscious decision to maintain control, rather than prolong survival at the cost of authority. Historians see this not as ignorance, but as a personal choice shaped by identity and power. What modern historians largely reject is the idea of a single dramatic cause. There is no strong evidence for poisoning, assassination, or sudden illness. Instead, scholarly consensus describes Elizabeth's death as the natural conclusion of a long, demanding life lived under constant pressure. Her body, like her reign, endured for many years before slowly reaching its limit. From a historical perspective, this type of death was common but rarely recorded in detail. Without post-mortems, diagnostic tools, or honest medical reporting, deaths were often described in vague terms. Elizabeth's case is not unique in this sense. What makes it notable is how closely her physical decline mirrors the emotional and political closing of her reign. As this part settles into quiet, imagine historians centuries later, reading letters, studying timelines, and weighing silence as carefully as words. No single answer emerges, only a picture of gradual fading. Elizabeth's death appears not as a mystery to solve, but as a human ending shaped by age, illness, grief, and choice. To understand the death of Elizabeth I more fully, historians often place it within the wider pattern of how monarchs in early modern England commonly died. When this broader view is taken, Elizabeth's death appears less mysterious and more representative of her time. Kings and queens in the 16th and early 17th centuries rarely died with clear medical explanations. Their deaths were usually slow, private, and shaped by age, stress, and limited medical understanding rather than sudden violence. Many English monarchs before and after Elizabeth experienced similar endings. Henry VII, her grandfather, declined gradually in his final years, marked by illness, withdrawal, and silence. Henry VIII, despite his power and resources, suffered years of physical decay before death, worsened by infection and limited treatment. Even later rulers, such as James I, would experience repeated illness and weakness rather than sudden fatal events. In this context, Elizabeth's death fits a familiar pattern of royal decline. Monarchs lived under extreme psychological pressure. Unlike ordinary subjects, they carried constant responsibility for state, religion, war, and succession. This pressure accumulated over decades. Historians increasingly recognize that long reigns often ended in exhaustion, rather than dramatic illness. Elizabeth ruled for over 44 years. By the end, her body and mind had endured far more strain than most people of her age. This cumulative stress likely weakened her resistance to illness. Another important factor is how death was managed at court. Royal illness was often hidden to maintain stability. Physicians were cautious in their language. Courtiers avoided detailed descriptions. As a result, many royal deaths appear vague in historical records. This does not indicate secrecy, but protocol. Elizabeth's final illness was observed quietly, without open discussion, in keeping with royal custom. Silence was part of governance. Religious belief also shaped how death was understood. In Elizabeth's England, death was seen as part of divine order. Illness did not always require explanation beyond God's will. This worldview reduced the need to identify precise causes. Acceptance mattered more than diagnosis. Elizabeth herself was deeply aware of this belief system. Her calm withdrawal may reflect spiritual preparation rather than confusion or fear. When compared to non-royal deaths of the same period, Elizabeth's passing appears typical for an elderly individual. Gradual loss of appetite, sleep disturbance, weakness, and silence were common signs of approaching death. What distinguishes Elizabeth is not the manner of her death, but the attention it receives because of her historical importance. The same quiet ending, experienced by countless others, becomes significant when attached to a queen. Historians also note that Elizabeth's careful control extended even into death. By resisting intervention, limiting speech, and maintaining posture, she shaped the narrative of her passing. She did not allow illness to become spectacle. This control aligns with her lifelong approach to rule. In this sense, her death was consistent with her character. From a historical perspective, Elizabeth I did not die differently from her age. She died within it. Her passing reflects the realities of early modern life, where age, infection, emotional burden, and limited medicine combined quietly. There is no need to search for extraordinary causes when ordinary explanations fit so closely. As this part grows quiet, imagine the long line of English monarchs, each facing the same human end beneath crowns and ceremony. Elizabeth's death joins this pattern, not as an exception, but as a final chapter written in the language of her time. Elizabeth I's death continues to fascinate historians not because it is mysterious, but because it is quietly revealing. In many ways, her passing tells us more about power, age, and human limits than a dramatic end ever could. When historians return to her final months, they are drawn not to a single cause, but to the atmosphere that surrounded her decline. Silence, restraint, and gradual withdrawal speak as loudly as any medical detail. One reason her death remains compelling is the contrast between the woman she had been and the way her life ended. Elizabeth was known for command, presence, and control. She spoke carefully, performed authority with precision, and ruled through image as much as policy. In her final years, that same instinct for control did not disappear. It transformed. Instead of public speeches and court spectacle, control took the form of silence, refusal, and stillness. Historians often note that this continuity of character suggests intention rather than confusion. Her refusal to eat, sleep, or submit to treatment can be read as physical decline. It can also be read as a final assertion of agency. In a world where monarchs were expected to be seen as strong until the end, Elizabeth chose not to display weakness openly. By limiting access to her body and voice, she maintained authority even as her strength faded. This interpretation does not romanticize her death, but it helps explain why it unfolded as it did. Elizabeth's death also highlights the relationship between monarchy and the human body. Kings and queens were presented as symbols of stability, continuity, and divine order. Aging threatened that image. Unlike modern leaders, early modern monarchs could not easily step aside. They ruled until death. As a result, decline was unavoidable and deeply personal. Elizabeth's withdrawal may reflect the tension between a failing body and an enduring role. Historians are also drawn to how little resistance there was to her passing. There were no riots, no widespread panic, and no immediate struggle for power. This calm suggests that England had already begun to imagine life beyond Elizabeth. Succession planning, though unspoken, was understood. Her death marked the end of an era, but not the collapse of a system. This quiet transition reinforces the idea that her decline had been long and visible. Another reason Elizabeth's death endures in historical discussion is what it reveals about early modern attitudes toward dying. Death was not always medicalized. It was often seen as a process rather than an event. People faded, withdrew, and accepted the end without clear diagnosis. Elizabeth's death fits this cultural pattern. The lack of a named cause does not indicate mystery. It reflects how death was understood at the time. Modern readers often search for certainty. Historians, however, learn to sit with ambiguity. In Elizabeth's case, the evidence points toward a combination of age, illness, emotional burden, and personal choice. This complexity resists simple answers. Yet it also offers a more human portrait. Elizabeth did not die as a symbol alone. She died as an aging woman who had carried extraordinary responsibility for most of her life. As this part settles into quiet reflection, imagine Elizabeth not as a painted queen, but as a person nearing the limits of endurance. The weight of memory presses gently. The noise of rule fades. What remains is stillness. In that stillness, historians find meaning, not in a single cause of death, but in the way a long life came to rest. Rather than ending with Elizabeth's final breath, historians often choose to continue the story by examining how her decline was interpreted in the months and years immediately after her death. This extended interpretation matters because it reveals how people of her time and later generations understood the relationship between power, health, and mortality. Elizabeth's death did not freeze her image. It reshaped it. In the years following 1603, writers and commentators reflected on Elizabeth's final decline with a tone of inevitability rather than tragedy. Chroniclers described her as having ruled until nature would allow no more. This phrasing appears repeatedly in early Stuart writings. It suggests that her death was framed as natural exhaustion rather than failure. The body had reached its limit after decades of rule, and society accepted this explanation without protest. Early Stuart England also inherited Elizabeth's medical ambiguity. James I's court did not attempt to clarify her cause of death. There were no official records produced later, no retrospective diagnosis, no interest in reopening questions. This silence is historically meaningful. New regimes often rewrite the past to justify themselves. In Elizabeth's case, there was nothing to correct. Her death required no political explanation. Medical understanding slowly evolved in the centuries that followed. But Elizabeth's case remained resistant to precise diagnosis. Even in the 19th century, historians struggled to label her death definitively. Victorian writers speculated about cancer, heart failure, or stroke. But these theories were based more on modern categories than on evidence. As historical methodology improved, scholars became more cautious. Rather than imposing certainty, they returned to the original sources and accepted their limitations. Elizabeth's decline also influenced how later monarchs approached aging and visibility. Subsequent rulers became more aware of the political risks of visible weakness. Some delegated authority earlier, Others retreated from public view more deliberately. In this way, Elizabeth's death shaped royal behavior indirectly. Her final years became an example of how power fades, even when authority remains. Another important continuation of her story lies in cultural memory. Elizabeth's long reign overshadowed her death. Paintings, plays, and national myth focused on her strength rather than her decline. This imbalance affected how her death was remembered. It was softened, almost absorbed into the larger story of her life. As a result, her passing feels quieter in history than the end of many shorter reigns. From a broader historical perspective, Elizabeth's death illustrates a truth about historical causation. Not all events have sharp endings. Some processes conclude gradually, without a single decisive moment. Her death was the final stage of a long process that included aging, isolation, illness, and emotional wear. Understanding this helps historians resist oversimplification. As this part continues in calm reflection, imagine Elizabeth's story extending beyond her lifetime, shaped by those who remembered her. The Queen herself fades, but interpretation continues. Questions remain open, not because answers are hidden, but because history sometimes offers only outlines rather than details. To understand Elizabeth I's death more fully, historians often place her alongside other powerful queens of early modern Europe who faced similar endings. This comparison does not seek to dramatize her passing, but to normalize it within a broader historical pattern. When viewed this way, Elizabeth's decline appears neither unusual nor suspicious. It reflects the shared reality of ruling women whose bodies aged under constant pressure and limited medical care. One useful comparison is with Mary, Queen of Scots. Although Mary's death was sudden and political, her final months show similar signs of emotional exhaustion and withdrawal. She lived under confinement, separated from authority and routine, which weakened her body and spirit. Elizabeth, by contrast, retained power until the end, yet experienced isolation of a different kind. Both women demonstrate how emotional strain could accelerate decline, whether death came by execution or by natural causes. Another comparison can be made with Catherine de' Medici of France. Catherine ruled as queen and regent for decades, and died in 1589 after a long period of physical weakness. Contemporary accounts describe fatigue, loss of appetite, and gradual fading rather than sudden illness. Like Elizabeth, Catherine lived beyond the average lifespan of her time and carried the burden of constant political tension. Her death, like Elizabeth's, was accepted as the natural result of age and wear rather than a single disease. Isabella IX of Castile, another long-reigning queen, also experienced decline in her final years. She suffered from illness, grief, and exhaustion after decades of rule and personal loss. Chronic sickness weakened her body long before death arrived. In Isabella's case, historians also struggle to assign a single cause. The pattern is familiar: emotional strain, physical illness, and age working together over time. These comparisons highlight an important historical truth. Ruling queens faced unique pressures. Unlike many male rulers, they were constantly judged not only for policy, but for body, image, and personal life. Aging was political. Weakness was interpreted symbolically. As a result, many queens withdrew in their final years, reducing visibility rather than allowing decline to be observed openly. Elizabeth's silence fits this pattern closely. Medical limitation affected all of these women. Physicians across Europe relied on similar theories and treatments. Bloodletting, purging, and herbal remedies offered little relief and often worsened weakness. Queens, aware of this, frequently resisted intervention. Elizabeth's refusal of treatment aligns with a broader pattern of elite mistrust toward early modern medicine, especially in old age. From a historical perspective, Elizabeth's death appears consistent with the lived experience of long-reigning queens. Power did not protect them from aging. Authority did not prevent decline. What it did shape was how death unfolded, quietly, privately, and without public disorder. As this part settles into calm reflection, imagine royal chambers across Europe, different languages spoken, different crowns worn, yet similar scenes unfolding, curtains drawn, voices lowered, bodies weakened by years of rule. Elizabeth's final years belong to this shared history, not as an exception but as part of a wider human pattern. From a strictly historical perspective, the death of Elizabeth I marked not only the end of a long reign, but the formal conclusion of the Tudor dynasty itself. This fact deeply influenced how her death was understood and recorded. When Elizabeth died without a direct heir, the Tudors ended quietly, not through overthrow or rebellion, but through biological finality. This shaped contemporary interpretation. Her death was seen as dynastic closure rather than crisis. The Tudors had ruled England since 1485, beginning with Henry VII. Over more than a century, the dynasty experienced instability, religious upheaval, and internal conflict. By the time Elizabeth reached old age, the dynasty had narrowed to a single person. There were no siblings, children, or close Tudor relatives remaining. This isolation increased the historical significance of her physical decline. Her health was no longer personal. It represented the endurance of an entire ruling house. Because succession depended on Elizabeth's survival, her declining health was observed carefully, though rarely discussed openly. Courtiers understood that once her body failed, the Tudors would disappear from power. This awareness likely contributed to the calm acceptance of her death. Plans for a Stuart succession had already been quietly prepared. Historically, this preparation indicates that Elizabeth's illness was expected to end in death rather than recovery. After her death, official narratives emphasized continuity rather than rupture. James the Forlorn was presented as a natural successor, descended from Henry VII through Margaret Tudor. This genealogical link softened the end of the Tudors and reduced the need to examine Elizabeth's death closely. When dynasties end violently, causes are scrutinized. When they end peacefully, explanation matters less. This context helps explain why her medical condition was not investigated further. Contemporary records focus more on transition than diagnosis. Proclamations, letters, and chronicles discuss allegiance, ceremony, and stability. They do not dwell on symptoms. This silence reflects historical priorities. The state needed reassurance, not medical clarity. Elizabeth's body was treated with dignity, but it was not examined as evidence. Early modern England did not seek post-mortem truth in the way modern societies do. The end of the Tudor dynasty also affected how later historians framed Elizabeth's death. Because her reign was remembered as a golden age, her death was often softened in narrative. Chroniclers preferred to emphasize the glory of her life rather than the weakness of her end. This selective focus shaped historical memory. Physical decline was acknowledged but rarely described in detail. From a structural historical viewpoint, Elizabeth's death was functional. It triggered succession without resistance. Government continued. Law remained intact. This functional outcome reinforced the interpretation of her death as natural and expected. There was no political incentive to question causes. Stability itself became evidence that nothing unusual had occurred. Looking at the Tudor dynasty as a whole, Elizabeth's death fits a pattern of gradual endings rather than dramatic collapse. Henry VII died after illness. Henry VIII declined over years. Edward VI weakened slowly. Mary Vi suffered prolonged illness. Elizabeth followed the same path. Tudor rulers rarely died suddenly. Their bodies failed under time, stress, and limited medicine. As this part continues calmly, imagine the Tudor line narrowing across generations until it rests in one aging queen. Her death closes a chapter that began more than a century earlier. Historically, this closure mattered more than the precise medical reason. The dynasty ended not with violence but with age. When Elizabeth I died in March 1603, her passing was observed not only within England, but across Europe. Foreign ambassadors, diplomats, and courts had followed her health closely for years. Their reactions, preserved in letters and reports, provide valuable historical insight because they were written for political intelligence rather than public ceremony. These accounts are often more direct, and they help confirm how Elizabeth's decline was understood beyond England. Spanish observers viewed Elizabeth's death through the lens of long rivalry. Spain had been England's greatest enemy during much of her reign, yet Spanish diplomats did not describe her death as suspicious or sudden. Reports sent to Madrid speak of age, weakness, and exhaustion. There is no mention of poisoning or intrigue. Instead, the Spanish court focused on the political implications of succession. The question was not how Elizabeth died, but what kind of ruler James would be. This focus suggests that Elizabeth's death was expected and accepted as natural. French diplomats recorded a similar understanding. Letters from the French ambassador describe Elizabeth as having been frail for some time. Her withdrawal from public life was noted well before her death. French reports emphasize her melancholy, silence, and refusal to eat. These details align closely with English accounts. The consistency across national boundaries strengthens their credibility. If her death had been sudden or suspicious, foreign observers would likely have noted it. Observers from the Holy Roman Empire and Italian states also commented on Elizabeth's age and declining health. These regions had no direct interest in shaping English public opinion, making their reports particularly valuable. Their correspondence describes a queen who had outlived her strength. Again, there is no emphasis on violence, poisoning, or conspiracy. The dominant theme is inevitability. Foreign courts were primarily concerned with stability. Elizabeth's death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of a new political phase. Diplomatic letters discuss alliances, religious policy, and future relations under James I. The lack of alarm in these discussions indicates that Elizabeth's death did not shock European politics. It was treated as a predictable event rather than a disruption. Another important historical detail is the timing of diplomatic reactions. Preparations for Elizabeth's death appear to have been underway quietly across Europe. Succession scenarios were discussed even before her final illness. This suggests that her declining condition was widely known. Foreign observers did not react as if an unexpected death had occurred. Instead, they adjusted smoothly to the new reality. From a historical standpoint, foreign accounts act as independent confirmation. When English, Spanish, French, and other sources all describe the same pattern, frailty, withdrawal, and gradual decline, the likelihood of accuracy increases. These observers had different interests, yet their descriptions converge. Foreign reactions also shaped Elizabeth's posthumous image. While England emphasized ceremony and continuity, other courts emphasized endurance. Elizabeth was described as a ruler who had simply lived long enough to see her strength fade. This portrayal lacks drama but carries respect. Even rivals acknowledge the length and resilience of her reign. As this part continues quietly, imagine messages crossing borders on horseback and ship. News travels slowly, calmly. Courts adjust. The political world moves forward. Elizabeth's death enters European history not as a mystery, but as a moment of transition understood across nations. After Elizabeth I's death, her physical decline was gradually overshadowed by the way her image was reshaped in memory, art, and official history. This process began almost immediately. The early Stuart period inherited not only the English throne, but also the responsibility of explaining the end of the Tudor age. How Elizabeth was remembered mattered deeply, and this influenced how her death was framed, softened, and sometimes quietly redirected. Official chronicles written after 1603 rarely dwell on Elizabeth's final illness. Instead, they emphasize the length and success of her reign. Chroniclers highlighted stability, national identity, and victory over foreign threats. Her death appears in these texts as a natural conclusion rather than an event requiring explanation. This selective emphasis reflects historical priorities. The new regime needed continuity, not doubt. Focusing on glory rather than decline helps smooth the transition from Tudor to Stuart rule. Visual art played an important role in shaping Elizabeth's posthumous image. Portraits continued to depict her as youthful, composed, and distant from physical weakness. These images were not meant to reflect reality. They were symbolic. By freezing Elizabeth in an idealized form, artists removed the uncomfortable reality of aging and death. This visual tradition encouraged later generations to remember her reign more vividly than her passing. Early Stuart writers also benefited from this idealization. By presenting Elizabeth as a timeless figure, they reduced the need to discuss the vulnerability shown in her final years. Her death became almost abstract. She did not die of illness in these narratives. She completed her course. Such language reflects early modern attitudes toward royal death. Monarchs were described as fulfilling destiny rather than succumbing to disease. This shaping of memory affected later historical interpretation. Because early sources minimized physical decline, later historians inherited gaps. The absence of detail encouraged speculation, even though contemporary observers had understood the situation clearly. In this way, silence itself shaped later questions about her death. It is also important to note that Elizabeth's own approach to image contributed to this outcome. Throughout her reign, she carefully controlled representation. She resisted realistic portraits and discouraged open discussion of her body. This habit continued indirectly after death. Courtiers and chroniclers followed established patterns of restraint. Speaking too openly about her physical decline would have felt improper. From a historical perspective, this image-making does not hide truth so much as redirect attention. Elizabeth's death was not denied. It was simply placed in the background. Her life, reign, and symbolic meaning took priority. This explains why her death feels quieter in historical memory than the deaths of some other monarchs. The result is a layered legacy. Beneath the idealized image lies a human ending shaped by age, illness, and emotional wear. Above it rests a carefully maintained portrait of authority and endurance. Historians today move between these layers, using surviving letters and foreign accounts to balance official memory with lived reality. As this part continues in calm reflection, imagine history being written not only by events but by choice. What is remembered is shaped as much by silence as by words. Elizabeth's death entered history gently, carried forward by an image that outlived her body. In modern historical scholarship, the death of Elizabeth I is often discussed not because new evidence has emerged, but because historians continue to refine how evidence should be interpreted. Over time, the focus has shifted away from searching for a single medical diagnosis and toward understanding why certainty is impossible. This change reflects broader developments in historical method, rather than disagreement about facts. One common misunderstanding is the belief that a precise cause of death must exist and can be recovered if historians look hard enough. In Elizabeth's case, this expectation is anachronistic. Early modern England did not record deaths with modern medical precision. There were no autopsies, no clinical notes, and no standardized reporting of symptoms. What survives are observations filtered through etiquette, fear of impropriety, and limited medical language. Modern historians therefore treat absence of detail not as concealment, but as normal practice for the time. Another misunderstanding involves applying modern disease categories too directly. Terms like cancer, heart failure, or stroke appear frequently in popular discussions, but these diagnoses require evidence that simply does not exist. Historians note that weight loss, silence, weakness, and withdrawal can indicate many conditions, especially in elderly individuals. Attempting to assign one modern label risks oversimplifying a complex decline. As a result, most scholars prefer broader explanations such as age-related illness or chronic decline. There is also a tendency in popular history to separate physical and emotional causes. Modern research increasingly challenges this division. While Elizabeth's contemporaries did not speak in modern psychological terms, they clearly understood that grief, melancholy, and isolation weaken the body. When historians include emotional strain in explanations of her death, they are not speculating freely. They are reflecting early modern beliefs, as well as modern understanding of mind-body interaction. Another debate concerns Elizabeth's refusal of medical treatment. Some early historians interpreted this as stubbornness or mistrust. More recent scholarship views it differently. Elizabeth was highly aware of how medical treatment appeared to others. Bloodletting, purging, and enforced rest were visible signs of weakness. For a monarch whose authority relied on image, avoiding these treatments was a political choice as much as a personal one. Historians now interpret her refusal as consistent with her lifelong control over representation. There is also discussion about whether Elizabeth's death was unusually delayed or prolonged. When compared with other elderly individuals of her era, her decline appears typical. Many people experienced weeks or months of fading, marked by stillness rather than pain. The difference lies in documentation. Because Elizabeth was queen, her decline was observed closely. Ordinary deaths left fewer traces. This visibility creates the illusion of uniqueness. Modern historians also debate how much weight should be given to silence in the sources. Some argue that lack of detailed symptom description hides information. Others argue that silence itself is evidence of acceptance. When courtiers, ambassadors, and chroniclers all refrain from speculation, it suggests there was little to speculate about. The consistency of restraint across sources strengthens this interpretation. From a historical perspective, the most responsible conclusion is cautious synthesis. Elizabeth's death was likely caused by a combination of age, chronic illness, weakened immunity, emotional strain, and refusal of intervention. This explanation aligns with surviving evidence without forcing certainty where none exists. It also respects the historical context in which her death occurred. As this part continues calmly, imagine historians returning again and again to the same letters, reading between lines, weighing words against silence. The truth does not sharpen into a single answer. Instead, it remains broad, human, and historically grounded, much like Elizabeth's life itself. As this long historical examination comes gently to rest, the death of Elizabeth I can be understood not as a mystery left unsolved, but as a life that reached its natural conclusion within the limits of its time. When all surviving evidence is considered together, letters, ambassador reports, court silence, medical knowledge, and political context, a clear historical pattern emerges. Elizabeth did not die suddenly, violently, or unnaturally. She declined slowly, as many elderly people did in the early modern world, shaped by age, illness, emotional burden, and choice. Her final years were marked by withdrawal rather than crisis. Silence replaced speech. Stillness replaced ceremony. These changes were not signs of confusion, but of transition. Elizabeth had ruled through visibility for decades. At the end, she ruled through restraint. By limiting access to her body and voice, she maintained dignity and control, even as strength faded. This consistency of character is one of the most historically significant aspects of her death. Medically, the evidence points toward cumulative decline rather than a single cause. Chronic infection, respiratory weakness, malnutrition, and exhaustion likely work together. Emotional strain, grief, loneliness, and the weight of succession further weakened her resilience. Tudor medicine could offer little help, and Elizabeth's refusal of treatment reflected both mistrust and political awareness. Her body was allowed to follow its course without intervention. Politically, her death achieved what many rulers feared but rarely accomplished: peaceful transition. The Tudor dynasty ended without rebellion. Authority passed smoothly to the Stuarts. This calm outcome reinforces the historical interpretation of her death as expected and accepted. Societies do not respond quietly to unnatural deaths. They responded quietly to Elizabeth's. In memory, her death faded behind the scale of her reign. Art, chronicles, and national identity preserved the image of strength rather than decline. This shaping of memory does not erase reality. It reframes it. Elizabeth's death became part of her legacy, not as an event to explain, but as a closing chapter that required no justification. From a historical standpoint, this is perhaps the clearest conclusion. Elizabeth I died as she lived, carefully, deliberately, and within the boundaries of her world. Her death reflects the realities of early modern life, where age and illness moved quietly, and where dignity often mattered more than diagnosis. As the night grows still, imagine the long Tudor century settling into silence. Candles burn low, records close. The Queen rests, not as a question unanswered, but as a life completed.